When a wife vanishes, suspicion often lands first on the person closest to her, her spouse. It isn't superstition, it's facts, opportunity, and human behavior. Most violent crimes against women are committed by someone they know. The spouse lives in the house, knows the routines, and has access that few others could ever claim. Investigators ask themselves, was there a motive? Money, jealousy, control. Sometimes all of it at once. They watch the spouse's every move, every hesitation, every inconsistency, every unexpected calm. In the first crucial hours, law enforcement focuses where the odds are highest, not because they assumed guilt, but because they cannot afford to ignore the obvious. It is a bias born of necessity, one that can lead to the truth or bury it entirely. And sometimes, the person who should be safest of all is the one hiding the darkest secrets. In early of December 1999, in the cold grip of winter, and just weeks before Christmas, Kathleen Mohn vanished. The holidays, a season of warmth and togetherness, made her disappearance feel all the more jarring, lonely, urgent, and deeply out of place. Every unanswered question grew heavier. Every passing moment became colder. Every thread of her disappearance pulled detectives closer to the people who should have protected her. To this day, Kathleen's loved ones are still searching for answers, still haunted by her absence. Decades later, her case remains a missing cold case, a chilling reminder that some mysteries refuse to fade. And somewhere, in the shadows, the person responsible waits too. Silent, patient, watching. Some questions never die. They linger. They watch. They wait. You're listening to Departed in Pennsyltucky, The Silence of Kathleen, The Cold Case of Kathleen Mohn. Chapter 1. A Light Before the Winter. Kathleen Mohn grew up in a quiet Wilmington suburb, the kind of place where neighbors knew one another, and dreams felt close enough to touch. She attended St. Elizabeth's School, a bright and compassionate girl who spoke often about her future. From an early age, Kathleen knew she wanted to work in the medical field. She wanted to help people. In 1979, she married Thomas Mohn, a reserved but thoughtful man whose family was well known in Ardmore, Pennsylvania. To Kathleen, it felt like the beginning of the life she had always imagined. Friends remembered how she seemed to glow in those early years, her laughter quick, her eyes bright with excitement about the future she and Tom were building together. Kathleen became an X-ray technician and worked tirelessly, standing beside Thomas as he attended dental school. When he finally opened his own dental practice in Ardmore, it felt like the payoff for years of sacrifice and long hours. From the outside, the Mohns looked like the definition of success. They worked together. They built a comfortable life. Eventually, their efforts allowed them to scale back to a 4-day work week an upgrade from their modest home in Kingswood near King of Prussia to a larger house in Gulf Mills in Upper Merion Township. To anyone looking in, they were a couple who had made it. But the most polished lives often hide the deepest fractures. Because behind the doors of that beautiful home, shadows were already beginning to gather. Chapter 2: Hollow Together. Yet, for those who observed closely, there was a subtle, persistent tension beneath the surface of Kathleen's seemingly happy life. Kathleen's visits home to Delaware were almost always alone, a quiet ritual that had hinted at the distance between her and Thomas. Weekends, which should have been spent together, were often spent apart. Kathleen told family members that Thomas was on the golf course, or in the company of another woman. Family members recalled that Thomas appeared only once, at a funeral, remaining in a corner, quiet and distant, leaving others to wonder how such different personalities could coexist in a marriage. Despite this, Kathleen was far from a lonely person. She had her family, her nieces, her friends, people who loved her and who she loved in return. She was a woman whose kindness and vitality left a mark on everyone she touched. Someone whose life, though ordinary on the surface, radiated a quiet light. But in the house she shared with Thomas, surrounded by the life they had built together, she could feel the emptiness pressing in. She was not alone, and yet she was profoundly alone when she was with him. A loneliness that could not be filled by laughter or conversation. A quiet ache she carried behind her smile. Though she and Thomas were unable to have children of their own, Kathleen poured her love into her brother Frank's daughters. One was even named after her. Kathleen became a second mother to them. Weekends spent together, school runs, summers at the pool, and yearly trips to the shore. They adored her laughter, her energy, her constant presence. In Kathleen's company, the ordinary became memorable, the everyday infused with joy and warmth. On the outside, their marriage looked ordinary, but behind the walls of their home, something darker was taking shape. A secret that would soon collide with Kathleen's life, in a way no one could ever have predicted. Chapter 3: Danger in Desire. By 1999, the Mohns were estranged. They still lived in the same house, but led separate lives. Thomas was rarely home, and Kathleen began to drink to cope with the loneliness and pain. She eventually quit and started attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, where she met a man named Robert Linder. Their connection at AA gave her a sense of companionship she had been missing. Around the same time, she began spending hours online, immersing herself in conversations with strangers, and building a world of connection that became central to her life. Kathleen confided to Robert about her troubled marriage, telling him that Thomas was a golf fanatic who spent long weekends at tournaments and had carried on a 14-year affair with another woman. He didn't care what she did, she said, never made time for her, and would simply disappear for days on end. Robert, a union plasterer, offered Kathleen a new life after she had struggled to persuade Tom to take her out, even on her birthday. Robert made Kathleen feel alive again, taking her dancing and treating her as an equal, despite their very different backgrounds. She was a mainline woman. He was a union man, earning perhaps half of what she was used to, and it didn't matter. And yet, for Kathleen, leaving was not so simple. Even a woman as strong and spirited as she could not step freely into the world when the walls around her pressed so tightly. The fear was constant. Thomas's controlling nature and simmering anger made the very thought of leaving dangerous. Every phone argument, every confrontation over money, every late-night disappearance of her husband into his own secret life reminded her that stepping away could provoke retaliation. Her independence had been quietly stripped. Her access to money was tightly controlled. Her car barely hers. Her freedom measured in minutes, dollars, and stolen weekends. Divorce could mean instability, vulnerability, even poverty. And Kathleen had always prided herself on competence and self-sufficiency. Leaving risked everything she had fought so hard to build. Then, there were the children she loved. Though she had none of her own, her nieces were like daughters, small mirrors of the family she cherished. To abandon them, or disrupt the delicate routine that held their life together, felt almost impossible. Her heart pulled in two directions, away from the man who trapped her, and towards the girls who depended on her. The manipulation was subtle, yet relentless. Years of guilt, coast compliance, and silent judgment had eroded her sense of freedom. She doubted herself. Was she overreacting? Was the marriage salvageable? Could she even survive alone? The house that should have been a sanctuary had become a cage. Every wall a reminder that freedom carried risk. Pressure came from outside too. Her father, a devout Catholic, insisted she work it out, warning that divorce was too easy for today's generation. The weight of family expectations, of social norms, of whispered judgments from those who loved her pressed down on Kathleen like ice. And yet, she remembered the good moments, the laughter, the brief flashes of joy, the life she once imagined. She longed to reclaim it, but the fear of stepping into the unknown or facing the world alone held her frozen. Even as she began spending weekends with Robert, she tasted freedom and connection outside the Mohn household. The threats of fear, obligation, and danger wrapped tighter around her, invisible but unrelenting. Her family didn't know about Kathleen's affair, but they did know she had reached the end of her rope with Thomas. Her younger brother, Frank, also knew she was planning to divorce, and they could see how serious she had become about moving forward with her life. Chapter 4: Fractures and Threats. By the fall of 1999, Kathleen and Thomas's marriage was quietly collapsing. For years, the cracks had been there, hidden beneath the routines of work, family visits, and the outward appearance of a successful mainline life. To outsiders, everything looked stable and even desirable. But inside the house, the marriage had long ago begun to feel like something else entirely. Kathleen had grown used to the loneliness of it. The weekends Tom spent on the golf course, the long stretches when he barely spoke to her, the quiet resentment that seemed to hang in the air whenever she tried to pull him into family gatherings or social events. Friends and relatives had noticed the distance between them for years. What they didn't realize was that Kathleen had finally reached the point where she was ready to walk away. By Thanksgiving of 1999, she had begun telling people close to her that the marriage was over. She had already taken the first real step. Kathleen quietly hired a divorce attorney who reviewed the couple's finances and gave her an assessment that stunned her. Because she had helped support Thomas through dental school and had worked alongside him as the practice grew, she had a strong claim to the business. If the divorce moved forward, she could be entitled to as much as 65% of the dental practice, along with several $1,000s a month in spousal support. For the first time in years, Kathleen began looking closely at the financial world that Thomas had always controlled. Money had long been a source of quiet tension between them. Thomas was careful, some say extremely careful, with his spending. Kathleen had told friends that Thomas rarely gave her cash, leaving her to rely almost entirely on credit cards for everyday purchases. Even something as small as a pack of cigarettes went on a credit card. His frugality extended to nearly every part of their life. Despite the practice's success and the comfortable home they shared, Kathleen still drove a 1993 Ford Explorer that had begun to show its age. She had asked Tom repeatedly, sometimes for more than a year, to replace it with something newer. Each time, he refused. To Kathleen, it felt less like thrift and more like control. The money was there, yet she found herself asking permission for things that should have been simple decisions. Over time, the small frustrations piled up until they became part of a much larger resentment. As the possibility of divorce became more real, the atmosphere inside the house began to change. On November 22nd, 1999, Thomas confided to his office manager that Kathleen was planning to leave him. He told her that Kathleen had fallen in love with another man. The news clearly shook him. The office manager later said he appeared distraught, his eyes red, as though he had been crying. But whatever sadness he felt soon hardened into something else. After Thanksgiving, the arguments between Kathleen and Thomas grew more frequent and more intense. Some of them spilled over into the late-night phone calls Kathleen made to Robert. During those conversations, Tom's voice could sometimes be heard in the background, raised, angry, demanding. Kathleen often sounded exhausted, and more than once, she seemed to be crying. Money remained a constant source of conflict, but it was no longer the only one. Tom had grown increasingly angry about the amount of time Kathleen spent on her computer. She would sit for hours online, chatting with people across the country, something he clearly resented. The computer had become a symbol of the life she was slowly building outside the marriage, a life that no longer revolved around him. 3 weeks before Kathleen disappeared, the tension finally boiled over. During one argument, Tom stormed into the room where she was sitting and ripped the computer straight out of the wall, yanking the cords loose in a burst of rage. The outburst frightened Kathleen deeply. Later, she confided she had hidden several shotguns the couple kept inside the house, worried that one of Tom's explosive moments might escalate into something far worse. Sometimes they turned personal in ways that left Kathleen shaken. Tom occasionally begged her to sleep with him, pleading for some sign that the marriage could still be saved. When she refused, the pleading often turned into anger. More than once, he shouted that she needed to end the relationship with Robert and start acting like his wife again. But Kathleen had already made her decision. She told Tom directly that she intended to file for divorce and that she was planning to build a new life with Robert. The confrontation devastated him. According to Robert, Tom became desperate, even humiliated. At one point, he dropped to the floor on all fours and begged Kathleen not to go through with the divorce. He warned her that the financial consequences would ruin him, and the practice he had spent years building might collapse under the settlement she was entitled to. But Kathleen had crossed an emotional line that she could not step back from. She had spent too many years feeling invisible inside her own marriage. Now, for the first time in a long time, she believed she could start over. Within a week, she would vanish. Chapter 5: The Weekend That Never Ended. By early December of 1999, Kathleen had settled into a routine that offered her brief but meaningless escapes from the tension awaiting her at home. Nearly every Friday evening, after finishing work at the dental clinic, she would pack a small bag, climb into her aging Ford Explorer, and begin the familiar drive north to Levittown. It had become a ritual of sorts, one that marked the beginning of a temporary life separate from the arguments and uncertainty that now defined her marriage. She usually arrived at Robert's house around 10 o'clock at night. The drive itself had become something Kathleen looked forward to. The quiet stretch of highway that separated her from Golf Mills and the difficult conversations that seemed to fill every room of the house she still shared with Thomas. For a couple of days each week, she allowed herself to imagine what her life might look like once the divorce was finalized, and the separation between them was no longer just emotional, but official. The weekends were simple. Sometimes they went out to dinner or met friends. Other times they stayed in, talking late into the night about the future Kathleen hoped was finally within reach. On Sundays, she would usually leave Levittown and drive south to Delaware, where she spent time with her father and other family members before eventually returning to Pennsylvania. The routine had become predictable, almost comforting in its consistency. As the Christmas season approached, the two spent time shopping for gifts. Kathleen adored her nieces, and the holidays were always something she looked forward to sharing with them. During one shopping trip, Robert purchased 2 presents for Ashley, a little girl whose parents shared the Levittown home where he lived. One was a remote-controlled doll named Skateboard Shannon, and the other was a set of Spice Girl dolls that had become wildly popular with children that year. The gifts were never wrapped. On the morning of Friday, December 3rd, 1999, Kathleen finished her shift at the dental clinic and prepared for another trip to Levittown. The drive would have been a familiar one by then, something she had done so many times. It required so little thought. Before leaving, she placed the Christmas presents in the back of her Ford Explorer. The plan was to bring them to Robert's house, wrap them together over the weekend, and then take them with her when she visited family in Delaware on Sunday. It was an ordinary plan for an ordinary weekend. But Kathleen never arrived. At first, Robert assumed that she simply had been delayed. Traffic on a Friday evening could be unpredictable, and the drive sometimes took longer than expected. As the night wore on, however, the delay began to feel unusual. Eventually, he picked up the phone and called the Mohn residence to see whether Kathleen had left. No one answered. He called again and again. By the time someone finally picked up the phone, Robert had called nearly 20 times. Thomas told him that Kathleen had already left the house earlier that evening, sometime around 9 o'clock. The explanation did little to ease his growing unease. If she had left when Tom said she did, she should have arrived long before then. The distance between Gulf Mills and Levittown was not far enough to explain the delay. Still, the night passed without answers. By Saturday morning, concern had begun to turn into something closer to fear. Robert spent much of the day driving through Levittown with a friend, searching parking lots, side streets, and shopping centers in the hope that Kathleen's Ford Explorer might appear somewhere unexpectedly. The town was large enough that she might have stopped somewhere along the way. But there was nothing. No car. No sign of Kathleen. By Sunday evening, the situation had become impossible to ignore. Kathleen's brother Frank called Thomas to ask why she had not arrived in Delaware that weekend, as she so often did. Thomas repeated the same story he had given Robert. She had left the house Friday night, and he had no idea where she had gone. The answer made little sense to Frank either. Together, Frank and Robert began searching the areas near Robert's home, driving slowly through neighborhoods and scanning parking lots in the fading daylight. Every empty space, every parked vehicle, briefly caught their attention before revealing itself to be the wrong one. Kathleen's Ford Explorer was nowhere to be found. Late that night, nearly 2 full days after she had last been seen, Thomas finally contacted police to report Kathleen missing. The delay immediately raised concerns. For investigators, the first hours after someone disappears are often the most important. Yet nearly 48 hours had already passed before authorities even knew that Kathleen Mohn was gone. Search efforts began in the bitter cold of early December. Officers canvassed nearby roads, spoke with neighbors, and tried to reconstruct Kathleen's last known movements. But from the very beginning, the investigation was plagued by a troubling absence of information. No witnesses had seen her leave. No one had reported seeing her car. No one knew where she might have gone. As the holiday season moved closer and Christmas lights began appearing on houses throughout Montgomery County, a heavy silence settled over the investigation. Kathleen Mohn had simply vanished. And with every passing day, the possibility of finding her alive seemed to drift further away. Chapter 6. A Car in the Cold. December 4th, 1999. The Pennsylvania Turnpike was quiet that morning, the kind of cold December day that made the asphalt shimmer beneath the weak winter sun. Surveillance cameras captured a familiar vehicle, a Ford Explorer, Kathleen Mohn's car, taking the Bristol exit at 9:54 a.m. It should have been a routine sight, part of the everyday flow of traffic, but something about the footage immediately struck investigators as unusual. Against the passenger window, a blonde woman leaned. Only her arm was visible, her identity impossible to make out. That fleeting image, frozen in grainy black and white, would haunt the investigation for months to come. By December 13th, 1999, 2 weeks after Kathleen vanished, her Ford Explorer had been found abandoned in the parking lot of a local KFC in Tullytown, just minutes past the Bristol exit. Inside, the scene was unsettling in its normalcy. Her prescription medications, her glasses, and even her purse remained, but her wallet was missing. Alongside it, the Christmas presents she had intended to wrap, small, ordinary gifts meant to bring joy, were gone. Cadaver dogs, trained to detect human remains, hid immediately inside the vehicle. It was a clear signal that something terrible had happened. Kathleen Mohn, who had vanished seamlessly into thin air, was almost certainly dead. A week later, Thomas Mohn arrived unannounced at his brother-in-law's home in Delaware. He carried the Christmas gifts Kathleen had purchased, still unwrapped. Her family was stunned by the visit. Thomas patted her father on the back and told him simply that Kathleen had left, that he didn't know where she had gone. The dolls were turned over to the police, but Thomas refused to explain how they had come into his possession. The gesture, meant to appear ordinary, only deepened the suspicion surrounding him. Investigators quickly ruled out Robert Linder, Kathleen's boyfriend. He had an airtight alibi, receipts, surveillance footage, and multiple witnesses confirmed that he was where he claimed to be that weekend. He even passed 2 polygraph tests. Apart from Kathleen's family, he was the only person to show genuine concern for her disappearance. But Thomas's behavior remained a mystery. He had never disclosed the couple's impending divorce or Kathleen's own affair with anyone outside the marriage. That information would only come to light later, during a more thorough investigation. Thomas stopped cooperating with the authorities and instead hired a criminal defense attorney. When a search warrant was executed at the Mohn residence, police found a pair of dirty jeans, a recently used shovel, and red smears on a wall. The stains, however, were determined to be animal blood rather than human. Still, the accumulation of oddities, the abandoned car, the gifts, his elusiveness, painted a troubling picture. By the time the investigation began to take shape, Thomas had already taken steps to move on. He married his longtime mistress shortly after Kathleen's disappearance, though the marriage ended in divorce after she accused him of using her for money. She later told police that Thomas had made vague remarks over the years about Kathleen's murder. In 2017, he had Kathleen declared legally dead, enabling him to access her pension, a sizable sum. Through it all, one fact remained unmistakable to her family. Kathleen Mohn would never have vanished willingly without contacting those she loved most, particularly her nieces who adored her. Her absence left a void that nothing could fill, a silence that only grew heavier with each passing year. For them, and for everyone who loved her, the holidays were forever changed. Every year, her absence created a hollow space that no gift or celebration could ever fill. Her brother Frank spoke of the constant ache left by her disappearance. The gap she had left in their lives could not be repaired, no matter how the years stretched on. Even as they moved forward, they carried the memory of Kathleen's warmth, her laughter, and her unflagging care for those she loved. It was this memory, more than any piece of evidence, that underscored the tragedy: a life stolen, a family forever fractured, and a mystery that the law could never resolve. The turnpike footage, the abandoned car, and the missing gifts were more than clues. They were a chilling testament to the fact that Kathleen Mohn's life had been violently interrupted, and the question that would haunt investigators and family alike for decades remained the same: who had taken her, and why? The questions lingered. What had happened in those final days? Could justice be achieved without the evidence that only a body could provide? And most haunting of all, could the family ever find the answers they desperately needed to move forward? Or would Kathleen Mohn's disappearance remain a permanent, unhealed wound? Chapter 7: Fragments in the Dark. In January of 2000, half of a human brain was discovered at Bethlehem's sewage treatment plant, just weeks after Kathleen disappeared. Investigators immediately wondered if it could be hers, but forensic experts cautioned against assumptions. Still, the grotesque discovery underscored the brutality that may have awaited her. Northampton County Coroner Zachary Lysek examined the organ, freshly severed, intact, and horrifyingly anonymous. DNA testing began, with no confirmed link to Kathleen, but every investigator involved felt the weight of the unknown. The stench, the darkness, and the uncertainty reminded them of the limits of even the most determined investigation. Some pieces never fit. Some answers never come. And for Kathleen Mohn, the shadows lengthened. Epilogue. Linger. Watch. Wait. Years have passed since Kathleen Mohn disappeared, but the questions, the pain, and the quiet void she left behind remain vivid for those who loved her. Her family continues to wrestle with the truth they cannot change. She would have never vanished willingly, and yet, despite every effort, she never returned. The story of Kathleen Mohn is also a story of the invisible chains that bind people within failing marriages. Even when both partners stray, leaving is rarely a simple act. Men often stay because of fear of losing status, financial security, or the life they carefully constructed. Pride and social expectations can make the very idea of walking away feel impossible. Women, too, can remain held back by emotional attachment, practical considerations, and a sense of duty to family. Fear of isolation, financial vulnerability, and the weight of shared responsibilities create barriers that can feel insurmountable. Kathleen herself faced these pressures. Her marriage had been distant, lonely, and controlling. Yet, like many, she had to weigh love, security, and habit against the promise of a new life. Her decision to leave, to build something separate for herself, required courage. The tension between desire and responsibility, between hope and fear, can trap people in relationships long past their breaking point, and sometimes with consequences as tragic as Kathleen's disappearance. Beyond social and financial pressures, psychological factors play a powerful role. Humans are wired to seek stability, to cling to the familiar even when it's painful. Habit, guilt, and fear combine to create the invisible restraints, making departure feel impossible. Affairs, rather than freeing someone, often intensify the strain, creating secrecy and anxiety that deepen the reluctance to leave. Kathleen's story illustrates the danger of these pressures when combined with deception, control, and unresolved conflict. Even decades later, the investigation, the surveillance footage, the abandoned car, and the gifts left behind tell a story of suspense, betrayal, and tragedy. But the true impact is emotional, a reminder that some fractures, some disappearances, can never be repaired. Kathleen Mohn's life, stolen in a flash of tragedy, remains a haunting testament to the human heart, to its attachments, its compromises, and its hidden fears. Her memory lingers in the empty spaces she left behind, in the unanswered questions, and in the love that endures, even when the person it belongs to is gone. It is a story of loss, courage, and the enduring weight of invisible bonds, forces that can shape and sometimes shatter lives, long after a final, devastating act. And somewhere, in the same shadows that swallowed Kathleen, the person responsible remains, waiting, watching, patient, unseen. The questions she left behind remain unanswered. Some mysteries never fade. Some questions never die. They linger. They watch. They wait. If you have any information about the disappearance of Kathleen Mohn, please call the Upper Merion Police Department at 610-265-3232. This concludes this week's episode of Departed in Pennsyltucky. I'm your host, Andrea Dudak. Tune in next time for more true crime talk without the Valley Girl squawk.